Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I am Bob Ellison, the president of the society, and I want to thank Graham as well as other programs and invite you to join us now for a discussion with Dror Goldberg, who is in the Department of Management and Economics at the Open University of Israel. He's previously taught economics at Bar Ilan University and at Texas A&M. He received his bachelor's degree in economics from Tel Aviv University and then his master's and doctorate from the University of Rochester. And even though he is an economist since 2005, he's been drawn into history, particularly 17th century economic history, and he is here to talk about his new book, just published by the University of Chicago Press, Easy Money, American Puritans and the Invention of Modern Currency. The Adam Rowe in the Wall Street Journal called this an engrossing narrative account, the first book-length attempt to explain why a defining concept in our global financial system emerged within a desperate theocracy on the fringes of the British Empire. Here at the Society, I think we're more familiar with the desperate theocracy on the fringes of the empire than the economic theory, and we're really delighted that Professor Goldberg is here to tell us more about easy money and how the Puritans helped invent the modern financial system. So welcome, Dror Goldberg.
Thank you very much. So this book is about a small piece of paper that has only one surviving copy at the Peabody Essex Museum. There are a few more specimens from the second issue of February 1691. This is from December 1690. That's the original thing. And this is the first modern currency. In what sense is it modern? It is modern in the sense that it does not rely in any way whatsoever on gold, silver, or any other commodity to back its value. In that sense, it is modern. Now, before I go into the details, I want to acknowledge the contributions of this society. The day in which I found out about this volume, that it's on the internet, free and searchable, that was one of the happiest days during the writing of this book. It saved me some trips, expensive trips, and I mean, even the printed version of this volume saved me a lot of time and money in deciphering the old records. So this is extremely helpful, and I hope you will do more with volumes like that will very much help research. I don't know what I would have done without this volume. It was completely essential for the research. So the topics I want to talk about, what do I mean by modern currency? Then I will discuss the context in which it was invented. First of all, colonial money, and I mean all the English colonies, and even the French one. Then I'll talk about the special thing about Massachusetts money in 1690. And then I'll try to understand how did this invention come about? Why was it in Massachusetts? So the first part is why, which relates to the necessity they felt to make this invention. And then I will also talk about the how, because the necessity to invent doesn't always mean that there will be inventions. Some people are more able than others to invent. And the Puritans had some characteristics which actually helped them make this breakthrough. And in the end, I would like to talk about something seems like a contradiction, exciting committee. But there is a committee there, and I call it, in retrospect, I call it the Massachusetts Open Market Committee, and I think it's very exciting. I'll keep this to the end. We can also talk about Salem witches, if we have time. There are some relations. Obviously, it's the time, and this is much more famous. So what is modern currency? Well, it used to be on our paper money a promise to redeem the paper with gold. Now we don't have that anymore. All we have is This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Public debts include taxes, and that's it. We don't have gold. We used to have gold in the monetary system, but not anymore. And gold disappeared in 2 steps. During the Great Depression, FDR simply confiscated all gold, and he told all Americans with an executive order, give us your gold and get Federal Reserve notes in return, and that's it. Gold was gone from the shops and from the homes. But gold was still in the background until 1971. There was a promise not to issue more paper money than some multiple of the gold supply of the Federal Reserve. There was also an international commitment to convert dollars held by foreign central banks into gold. And this commitment was supposed to restrain the Federal Reserve from printing too many dollars. And through this international system, the entire world was supposed to avoid high inflation. But in 1971, in this speech, President Nixon cut the link between gold and money. It was a temporary suspension, that's how we called it. And this temporary thing survives to this day. So gold is out of the monetary system. Central banks may hold gold, just as they may hold diamonds and Bitcoin. Nothing special about gold anymore. And maybe it will remain like that. Maybe there will be a return to gold. Who knows? But the point is that since 1971, we don't have gold anymore. All we have is this legal tender status of the paper money. And that happened for the first time, not just in America, but in world history. That happened for the first time in Massachusetts in 1690. What happened in the colonies before 1690? In terms of money, it was a very strange world. It wasn't just paper money replacing an economy that deals with coins, as we might think. It was a very strange economy for decades. So, for example, here you have a map of New York, or as it was known then as New Amsterdam. You have Manhattans, and you have 4 beavers there. Up north, near Fort Orange, which is Albany. You also have a Turkey, but that wasn't really important. The important thing are the four beavers, because Native Americans could hunt them and sell them to the Dutch, in this case, or the English in Plymouth, or the French in Canada. And then these beaver furs would be shipped to Europe and be used to make hats. That's it. New York, Plymouth, Canada, it's all about making hats. That was the economic foundation of coming to live in this very cold region. So I found it on the internet. I don't know if that's, if this is how the processed beaver fur looked like. Seems pretty authentic to me. So you can think about it like a big coin. They actually used beaver as money in all these colonies, especially in Canada. And even in Massachusetts, in the first few laws in the 1630s, they speak about money and beaver. Money meaning English coin, and beaver. So they had the same legal status for various purposes. Money and beaver. That was pretty standard. And this phenomenon of using the main product of the colony as its money, that was standard. So in Plymouth, they also used maize. In Bradford's journal, he has this nice account in 1623 or 24. He says that people are starting to trade with each other with maize, and it's better than silver. And in Virginia, they had tobacco. Tobacco completely took over all the monetary functions, not just as a medium of exchange, but also the unit of account. In 1624, the official budget of Virginia was in pounds of tobacco. Not in English pounds, but in pounds of tobacco. And in other English colonies, Barbados was a big colony. They used sugar because that's what they grew. So they used all these weird monies. Why? So they already knew why. They knew that they wanted to import more than they exported. So they wanted to buy all these very basic European manufactures because they were sophisticated Europeans, they wanted to have chairs and to have glass windows and to have pillows and guns and papers. And the Native Americans couldn't produce any of that. The colonists couldn't produce these things yet. So they were kind of desperate to buy whatever European ships brought them. So they paid for that with all their products, like beaver furs, but they wanted even more. So they paid with their coins, and then there were not enough coins for domestic circulation. Colonists say that sometimes they go for months without seeing a single coin. So they improvised with what we call in economics commodity monies. Of course, there was also the wampum, which was the money and jewelry of the Native Americans. And Massachusetts was perhaps the first to make this official money for small change. Maybe Plymouth and New Amsterdam were first, but their records are somewhat lost in this period. They are incomplete. So the first definite record comes from Massachusetts in 1637, right after the war, the Pequot War that brought Massachusetts to Long Island Sound. Another interesting invention of Massachusetts, they pretty quickly they went ahead of other colonies. They were not content with those primitive commodity monies. In 1635, they made bullets legal tender for small change. Why bullets? Well, they didn't have money even for big change, for small change definitely. And as you see in this picture, it was an armed society. Every family had a gun, and the bullets were just lead balls, and you could make them at home with this mold. And they use this as money. They say, well, everyone has it. We all know how it needs to look like. All right, let's use it as money. And they were also the first colony to legalize the use of foreign coin, Dutch coin and Spanish coin. They also passed a law already in 1631. It's amazing. 1 year after Winthrop arrived, they made a law that all bills can be assigned from one to another. So if you issued an IOU, everyone can pass it along to pay for goods. England wouldn't have such a law until the 18th century. So in many ways, Massachusetts already in the 1630s, they charged ahead and left all the other colonies behind. I'll try to explain later why, in case it's not clear. Massachusetts was also the only colony to open a mint. It happened in 1652. Normally there was a royal monopoly on coinage, but there was no royal in 1652. There was someone in exile who claimed he was King Charles II, but not really. That was after the execution of Charles I, and monarchy was abolished. So Massachusetts used the opportunity to issue its own coins, the only colony who did it. Virginia actually had the right in its charter to issue its own coins in the 1607 charter, but it was too poor, and by the time it might have done so, it lost the charter and it became a royal colony. So Massachusetts was the only one, and by the way, they were not the only ones in the English Empire. In England itself, thousands of small businesses began issuing their own token coins, pubs and chandlers and all kinds of businesses who needed small change. But in Massachusetts, it was by a colonial government, and it was for larger amounts. This is for 12 pence. That was kind of big. Another colony was Canada, and Canada issued this money on the top, improvised from playing cards. That happened in 1685. This is not authentic, actually. It's a reconstruction by the Bank of Canada. So if you look at North America, that was the first paper money. But I don't find it very exciting. Why? Because it was just a continuation of an old tradition from the old world. So below you have Chinese paper money, and you have Dutch paper money from the Spanish siege of Leyden in 1574. So paper money was not new to Europe, and what was the tradition was that you supported paper money in two ways. either you threatened everyone with penalties in case they refused it. In China, Marco Polo tells us, and all educated Europeans knew that. In China, if you refused to accept the paper money of the government, you were executed. That was very well known. And in other cases, like in the Spanish siege of Leyden, they issued this paper money, probably forced everyone to use it, but also promised to redeem it with coin after the siege. It was quite an amusing siege, because it ended when the Dutch broke the dams and came with the navy. And the Spaniards didn't know what to do with that. They were not ready for that. And this is an old Dutch trick. So when Canada in 1685, and this is pretty close to Massachusetts, when they issued paper money, yes, it was the first paper money in North America, but it was an old new paper money. There was nothing fundamentally different about it, just importing an old idea from the old world. And then we come to 1690. This is obviously not an authentic map. This is the first attempt of the English colonies to invade Canada and, in fact, occupy it. So this was part of a larger war. It was called the King William's War here. And a force of New York and Connecticut tried to march all the way to Montreal, while a fleet of Massachusetts and Plymouth sailed around and tried to occupy Quebec City. And the distance here is the key point, because it took them 3 months to sail and return. 3 months wages, that's a lot of money. And that was the key point in what happened next. So what happened next is the soldiers returned, cold, hungry, sick of smallpox, and they wanted to be paid. Now, the tradition was that each soldier gets this financial instrument called debenture. Today, this term also exists in the financial system. It means something very different. Back then, it was an acknowledgement of the Treasury's obligation to a soldier when he was discharged. So here it says, there is due unto John Corsair for serving their majesties against the French and Indian enemy as a cook under the command of John something, master of a ship, the sum of 9 pounds, 1 shilling, 6 pence. 9 pounds, that's a lot of money. That's a wage of 3 months for a cook. You could buy too many groceries with that. So it was too much for shopping. So a soldier who received that couldn't actually go to a shop and buy anything with it. It also wasn't even a round amount. So 9 pounds, 1 shilling and 6 pence. So the first thing that the general court, the government did, was to say you can pay your taxes with the debentures. How is that helpful? Well, if you are a soldier and you received it, and you also received a tax bill, and taxes increased enormously. They had this unit called the rate per year. They increased it from 1 rate to 20 rates. That was the unit. Huge increase in taxes to pay the soldiers for this failed expedition. So soldiers also got tax bills. So the government said, well, at least you can discharge your tax bill with it. Probably they also realized that this could induce sellers in the market to accept the debenture as payment, because sellers are taxpayers and they will need to pay taxes to the government one day, pretty soon. So that might induce them to accept this as pay, and this will solve the soldiers' problems. But that didn't work, probably because it was a huge amount, and you can't go shopping with that. So what they did next was something seemingly technical and small, but it was a revolution in the history of money. And that's what brought me, an economist, to look into this invention. So instead of 9 pounds, 1 shilling and 6 pence, you have here a bill for 5 shillings. So these 9 pounds, you can break it down to 36 bills of that magnitude. 5 shillings, yes, you can go shopping with that. You can buy enough food to feed your family for a week. I did some calculation in the book. And it's round, and it doesn't even have the soldier's name. That kind of looks like paper money. The names at the bottom, the three names, they are just members of the committee that issued this paper money. And it says these bills, they didn't call them money, these bills shall be in value equal to money and shall be accordingly accepted by the treasurer and receiver's subordinate to him in all public payments. In other words, you can pay your taxes with that. And that was good enough. And initially the population was skeptical, and Cotton Mather put them back in line, wrote a pamphlet to convince them, and perhaps the commander of the expedition, Sir William Phipps, perhaps he also converted some of his own money for this paper money. I mean, converted paid gold coins or silver coins to whoever wanted to get rid of this. But eventually it worked. It worked, and it seems like something small and technical, but actually it is a breakthrough. Why? Because they minted the debt itself. What do I mean by that? What is the idea of minting invented in the Middle East 2,600 years ago? What is minting? You take this lump of, let's say, gold, and you cut it down to small, standardized, anonymous pieces that are good enough to go shopping with. And that's what they did here with the debt. They had this debt. It was not something tangible like a lump of silver or gold, but they cut it into small units, standardized, round denominations, anonymous. You didn't have the soldier's name here. That's it. They minted the debt. And you no longer needed anything of intrinsic value to back the paper. So in those paper monies I showed before, from Canada and China and the United Provinces, that siege of Leyden, there was some commodities in the background that actually backed the paper money. So if the Dutch promised to convert the paper money into gold coins at the end of the siege, well, there was some gold coin in the back. The Chinese did something different. The backing was forced on sellers in the markets. You could take your paper money to sellers and demand whatever commodities that seller had, and he had to supply. And here you have something totally different. Here you rely on the circulation of money into the treasury in tax payments and out of the treasury in payment to the government's creditors. And that's it. And you don't need any commodity. It's good enough to get the money circulating. It's not good enough to prevent inflation. That's a problem that we are dealing with to this day. So that was the invention. Actually, the problem was this. The government owed a debt to soldiers, and they raised taxes, so taxpayers owed that to the government, and the taxpayers were also sellers. They were kind of, everyone sold something, either goods or their work services, and they had paid taxes. That was kind of the normal, normal taxpayers were also sellers of something. And the solution was to get around these debts. The government issues a bill, that's step number one, to the soldier. The soldier takes this to the shops and receives food for the bill. And then the sellers, as taxpayers, return the bill to the government. And that's it. You have circulation, full circle. You can do it with a silver coin. You can do it with a cow. You can do it with paper money. That's it. To get the thing circulating, it's enough that it is legal tender for taxes. Now, why did they do all that? So first of all, why didn't they issue coin? I mean, I told you that they had a mint and they did issue coins. Why didn't they issue new coin in 1690? And when I tell you why not coin, I will have to tell you why they didn't force paper money like Canada did 5 years earlier. So regarding the coin, eventually the king returned. King Charles II didn't like the mint, and eventually the mint was closed in 1682 probably. And that was kind of a very serious disagreement between the king and the colony, because for the king this was high treason. They infringed on his prerogative of issuing the only coins in the English Empire. So even after they closed the mint, he took away their charter in 1684. Now, issuing coin again without English approval, that was out of the question. Now, you might think, well, they could issue paper money, like Canada, and force all the sellers and all the soldiers to accept it. If you don't, I mean, we're talking about war, a serious war. And we're talking about Puritans. They liked to regulate everything. Actually, the first newspaper in America was issued during this expedition in October 1690. It was called Public Occurrences. And the General Court was furious that someone did that, and they shut it down. And there was no other newspaper in English America until the 1700s. So they were definitely not liberals of today. And you might expect, well, it's war, you issue money, you have to. Why did you just force it on everyone? Well, the problem is that if you forced it, if you called it money, if you forced the soldiers and the sellers to accept it, as Canada did 5 years earlier, and they knew about Canada, well, that would look like money. That would look like paper money. And then you would get in trouble with England again. And this was a particularly sensitive point in time, because they lost the charter in 1684. Then England imposed a dictatorship on them, the Dominion of New England. In 1689, following the Glorious Revolution in England, Massachusetts rebelled and toppled the Dominion, and they resurrected the General Court and lobbied King William to give them back the charter or give them a new charter. So this was a critical point in time in which you didn't want to annoy the king. You didn't want to again, do something that looks like you're making money without English approval. And that was solved by 1691. So 1 year later, Massachusetts did receive a new charter. And then they did force the paper money on other creditors. So it became legal tender for debts and taxes, like our money. So that's about the why. So, and again, it relates to necessity as the mother of invention. They had to come up with a solution to the situation, and that's what they came up with. But in fact, many governments in the early modern period had this problem of not being able to pay their soldiers, and they did not invent a new type of paper money. What they did was nothing. The soldiers mutinied, defected, plundered the towns of their own employers. That was actually the rule. In England itself, during the civil wars, again and again, whoever was in power, the king, parliament, Cromwell's son, whoever thought that he was in control, lost control because he couldn't pay soldiers. Routinely, governments failed in dealing with the situation of how to pay soldiers. So necessity is the mother of invention, but alone it's not enough. You also need some ability. And the Puritans were kind of special people in many ways that are well known, but some of their characteristics, I think, actually helped them do this. So I give here an example of Elisha Hutchinson for the simple reason that he headed the committee that issued the paper money. I put it with a question mark because it is conjecture that this is the man in the portrait. It's held at the Harvard Art Museums. And for many years it was thought that this was Sir George Downing. But it is extremely unlikely actually, because when Downing was this age, he was a graduate of the first class of Harvard. When he was at this age, he was in England, and he was the number one traitor of the Puritan cause. He switched sides. He became a servant to King Charles II. He extradited some regicides from the United Provinces. So the idea that the Hutchinson family, that the Winthrop family, his relatives here, that the Winthrop family imported the portrait of Downing and kept it for generations, it's as likely as the Skywalker family keeping a portrait of Darth Vader, helmet and all. It's that likely. So in 1982, one of our members, Jonathan Fairbanks, in a book about New England art, he claimed that this was actually probably the best candidate is Elisha Hutchinson. Because of these weird clothes, that was the military company, artillery company, and some circumstances and his age and other members whose portraits are known. So this was Elisha Hutchinson. Now, I showed you this diagram before of government, soldier, seller, taxpayer. Now, one strange fact about colonial Massachusetts is that the merchants did everything. They were in the government. They were not often in the governor position, but they were always in the council. They were very dominant. Hutchinson was a councillor in 1690. He was also the major of Boston's regiment. He was a merchant, so that was one of the top sellers, and he has been all his life. Even his father was a merchant, so he was one of the top sellers. He was one of the biggest taxpayers, but he was also Boston's tax commissioner. So Hutchinson himself was in all these positions. You did need to tell him about the interests and the points of view and the perspectives of all these parties that are involved. He was all that. It was all in his head. He didn't have to talk to anyone. It's not like today where most politicians are lawyers. He actually did at the same time, at the same moment in time. I'm not talking about different phases in his career. In 1690, he was all that. And I think that this helped him, or could have helped him, or other councillors, to come up with this idea of how to solve the problem with easy money, with cheap paper that is backed by nothing other than its acceptance in taxes. It didn't have to be Hutchinson. I talk about Hutchinson because, again, he headed the paper money committee. It might have been, this is his grave. I went to visit it today again. He's mentioned at the granary burying ground only because he's buried with two more people there, his second wife and her first husband, John Frick. So this is called the Frick tomb, and the three of them are there, and that's why he's mentioned. But other than that, he's not known to have done anything important. Hutchinson might not have been the real innovator here. We don't simply have the records. The only thing I have is that he headed the paper money committee, and the second man listed was the treasurer. And that's significant because I looked at all the committees in Massachusetts history up to that point, hundreds of them, maybe more than 1,000. And you don't put the treasurer second in a financial committee, definitely not for the most important financial operation when the soldiers threaten a mutiny. So the fact that he was first means to me that at the very least, let's say he sponsored the bill in modern terms. He promoted it. I can imagine they have this council meeting and people say it will work, it will not work, and he's saying it's going to work, I'm putting my name first, people will trust me. I can imagine that. It means something that he was listed first. But it could also be one of his best friends, the famous diarist Samuel Sewall. Why do I say that? Because Sewall had somewhat similar background. He was a merchant, he was a counselor. He was also a commander in the military, but he hated it. He wasn't the military character. On the other hand, he studied at Harvard. And at Harvard, he definitely read Plato, who said that money is something artificial. It doesn't have to be metal. At Harvard, he read Aristotle, who said that money is a creature of law. At Harvard, he read Thomas Hobbes, almost their contemporary, who said that the essence of money is circulation into the treasury and out of it. Thomas Hobbes, not many years before that. So he compensated for his lack of military experience compared to Hutchinson with the fact that he studied things theoretically at Harvard. And this is his handwriting. As far as I can tell, I looked at his records of 1690, and Sewall had the best, the most eloquent handwriting when he made the effort. He didn't always make the effort, But when he did, I compared it to many other documents. This is the draft of the bill, of the paper money that the council approved. So it could have been him. I'm not saying that it definitely had to be Hutchinson. It could have been Sewell as well. In general, all the councilors had this kind of background. They did many things at the same time. Oh, I forgot to mention, Sewell also had a distinction of, note this, he owned the closed mint because it was run by his father-in-law, John Hull. And a few years earlier, he ran the printing press of Boston. He was the only one in the colony who had both the mint as property and experience in printing documents. So it could have been him, I don't know. I don't have all the information. Another person at Harvard was Cotton Mather. As I told you, he tried to convince the population right after the money was issued that they should accept it. Later, a few years later, in his biography of Sir William Phipps, the late William Phipps, he said this, they, meaning us, presently found that an expedient to serve as an example for any people in other parts of the world. So here he is actually a prophet. He is a prophet of legal tender paper money. And he was right, because today, all over the world, we use Massachusetts money. And he's the first on record to put it very clearly. We invented here something very new and great for us. And actually, in this pamphlet that he wrote, he addressed it to the treasurer, John Phillips, which was his father-in-law. And he says, do you remember we had this discussion about the nature of money? So again, having Harvard was important. Having a mercantile elite was important. No other colony had a college up to that point. And Boston was the hub, the mercantile hub of all of English America. So the Puritans had these features. They were not, obviously, the poor immigrants who went to Virginia. They immigrated for religious reasons, which meant that some of them, not all of them, but some of them were middle class. So the pilgrims also came for religious reasons, but they were poor and not educated. But Massachusetts had both poor and middle class and even a few rich people. And that's why it was a very different society. I still haven't seen any example of a new colony anywhere starting a college within 10 years. That was just amazing. And they were a step ahead of everyone. And I think this is also the reason why they had all these inventions beforehand. The bullets, the transferable IOUs, the adopting of foreign coins, all the way, not only in 1690, but all the way they were the cutting edge of monetary innovation. How am I doing with the time?
4 minutes.
All right. So now when you're fully awake and motivated, I would like to talk about the exciting committee that I promised you. So this is the printed broadside of the law that they printed, distributed in the colony. And this whole explanation of these bills, they didn't want to call them money, obviously, these bills back then had a commercial meaning. It did not mean like today that a bill is money. Bill was an IOU. So the terminology was specifically not monetary. But how do they start? It is ordered by this court that Major Elisha Hutchinson, Major John Phillips, Captain Penn Townsend, Mr. Adam Winthrop of the famous family, and Mr. Timothy Thornton, or any three of them, be and are hereby appointed and empowered a committee. So this Legal Tender Act, to use a later terminology, actually starts by appointing a committee. Now, committee was the standard way of doing things. The Massachusetts Bay Company was not prepared in terms of its charter to run a semi-independent jurisdiction. It was a commercial company. They didn't have the bureaucracy of a colony. So they improvised with committees. And because of this committee, I went to look for 60 years of history. They did almost everything by committee. whatever they needed. They didn't have, there was no treasury department. There was a treasurer, that's it, in his person. That was it. He was a creditor of the colony for the colony's expenses, and he was the colony's debtor in all the tax proceeds he received. Almost zero bureaucracy. So for everything, they appointed committees. Now, and here you have 5 members. Okay, that's a reasonable amount of money. When they have to sign, they have to have, see there at the bottom, 3 signatures manually, not part of the printing, but manually, sign each and every bill. It means that whatever decisions they make, and here the authority is set specifically, they had a limit. They couldn't issue more than £40,000, which was the debt to all the soldiers, but they could issue less if they wanted to. They chose the denominations. There was no previous paper money to copy. They decided to have these 5 shillings paper money. They could have chosen differently. They could choose the pace in which to put the new money into the economy. So it wasn't just something administrative. They actually had a lot of discretion. So these 5 men, now who were they? So Hutchinson and Phillips, they were councillors. Captain Penn Townsend, he was the Speaker of the House of Deputies. So all 3, they are kind of, let's say, part of the government, broadly defined, or public sector. On the other hand, Winthrop and Thornton, the other 2 members, are private people. They were both involved in an attempt to start a bank in Boston a few years before that, but at that point in time, they were private individuals. That was not unusual in committees. It was normal to have councillors, deputies, meaning the lower house of the General Court, representatives in later terms, and private people. That was normal. And I think that here they wanted to have a significant representation of the private sector because all of them were merchants, by the way, because merchants were the ones who were the biggest creditors of the government. They lent the big amounts. The government owed money to the soldiers, as we saw in these debentures, but the big amounts were to the merchants. And merchants didn't want, they had an interest not to have too much paper money issued or too quickly, because inflation could hurt their property right in the debt that the colony owed them. So they put there 2 people of the private sector. Now, the government, broadly defined, could override them. They had the majority, 3 people as opposed to 2, but only if they had a consensus. Now, this is interesting, and in the context of all the previous Massachusetts committees, it's not unusual. What is unusual is how similar it is to the committee that today decides how much money will be in the economy. Today it is called the Federal Open Market Committee. Looks like this, but there are many people in the room, but only 12 of them have a voting right. And who are the 12? There are 7 members called the Board of Governors. They are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And 5 members appointed by, they are presidents of Federal Reserve banks. They are appointed by the private sector. So you have 7 people of the public sector, executive plus legislature, 5 people of the private sector, 7 to 5. Whereas in 1690, it was 3 to 2. Is this a coincidence? This Federal Open Market Committee was established in 1935 by FDR, part of the reforms of the Great Depression. I don't think it's a coincidence. Is it possible that someone at the FDR administration read ancient monetary history, decided to go back to the origins? Not likely. I can even propose a crazier hypothesis and rule it out immediately. FDR himself was a descendant, biological descendant of Hutchinson. The Bush presidents also, by the way. So was it something in the family? I don't think so. What I think is something far more interesting. So I promise that this will be an exciting committee. So when I started doing this project back in 2005, as a complete outsider. I'm not an American, I'm not even British, I'm not even a historian, or I wasn't at least. So some people were more welcoming than others. And I remember asking this historian at Texas A&M, his name was Jim Rosenheim. I asked him, is this even legit that, as a foreigner, I will come to the US and teach you something about your history? And he replied with one word, Tocqueville. And I was like, what do you mean? So, well, it's actually an advantage. It comes from outside. You can see things that we don't see. So here, I'm going to be reckless and play Tocqueville with some Israeli chutzpah. And I will make the claim that it's not a coincidence, that this is part of the American DNA. You give the private sector a meaningful role in running society. Not decisive. So here it's 2 out of 5. In the current committee, it's 5 out of 12. It's not decisive, but it's not 0. And it's part of a larger phenomenon. Every November, you go to vote for many things, for DAs or sheriffs or judges or this bill or that bill or president. Where I come from, in our democracy, I vote once every 4 years and then I'm out. Like nobody asks me. I have no role in government. You serve in jury. Second Amendment, obviously I'm not going to get into this controversial issue, but whether it's good or bad, but there is some significant role for the private sector. And I think this is the phenomenon. So the checks and balances between the public and private sector, they were in place, at least in Massachusetts, long before the Constitution. And they were put back in place in the monetary system in 1935. They were actually forgotten in between. So the Federal Reserve is the third central bank of the United States. No other country has this record. But there were 2 banks of the United States. This is the first on the left. That's me there with a financial historian called Richard Silla. Both of them were in Philadelphia. The first on the left, the second on the right. The first was invented by Hamilton. He thought he could just take from Britain this idea of a very dominant central bank, the Bank of England, and just implant it in America. Hamilton was a genius, but like me, he was a foreigner, and there were apparently things about America I didn't really get. He thought that something so centralized could work in the United States, and he was wrong, because the Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years, and it was not renewed. It died politically. The second bank had the same fate. The original Federal Reserve System tried to do the opposite, and that's why it's so decentralized. 12 reserve banks, they had their own authority to run monetary policy. It was enacted in 1913, and it survived for 22 years, slightly more than these 2, until this change of 1935 that actually turned the Federal Reserve, in practice, turned it to a normal central bank. Today, the Federal Reserve banks, they don't really do the policy. So in that committee that does policy, they have now only 5 out of 12. It used to be their committee. That's why they have 12 people in the committee, because originally it was representative of the Federal Reserve banks. And then FDR came, kicked out 7 of them, and put this board of governors of 7 people that he appointed. So the US forgot the lesson of Massachusetts and didn't give the private sector the appropriate role in its central bank 3 times. And only in 1935 they got it right. And when I say they got it right politically. I'm not getting at all into the question of whether the Federal Reserve is good for the economy or not. Just saying that it does survive politically. Already now it has survived more than its 3 predecessors combined. All right, do I have time for witches? All right. So obviously, one of my first concerns was how could they be so brilliant in money and so stupid in witches? And I asked around and I got some very interesting ideas, but eventually I think the situation is this. In one word, it's Harvard. Being intellectual in those times meant both that you were interested in monetary theory, like Cotton Mather, and that you were interested in witches, like Cotton Mather. In 1688, he published his first book about witches, his exorcism. He went to this family, and from what he describes, he was either insane or a liar. I mean, like, chairs flying in the air or something like that. That was mainstream science. In England too, that was mainstream science. In fact, Newton who published his famous book just 3 years before that. He was as much interested in biblical prophecies, and he looked into the dimensions of the Jewish temple to try to find some cosmic meaning. So that was mainstream. In fact, the 17th century was the century of the scientific revolution, in which people like Galileo and Newton and what was his name? Torricelli and William Gilbert, they tried to understand those forces of nature which were obviously there but were not tangible. So the magnetism and gravity and air pressure, these are all the people that I mentioned, that was the main thing, right? Newton, gravity, it's a force that is there, but you can't touch it. I mean, it operates between objects not touching each other. It's kind of mysterious, like how it works. And witchcraft, I argue, is exactly of the same class. They just knew that if some kid was sick in a house, it's because his evil neighbor did it. They just knew it. It was obvious to them. They didn't know how. They didn't see this mysterious force, but they just knew it was there. So that was mainstream science. And those intellectual aspirations of Cotton Mather, who would be the first American member of the Royal Society of London, it's the same thing that made him interested in monetary theory, also made him interested in witches. So I cannot explain the witches, I'm just saying it's actually consistent with an advance in monetary economics. In fact, a revolution in monetary economics. Putting those useful commodities, backing paper money, putting them aside, and just relying on circulation of money into and out of the treasury of the emerging fiscal military state, as it is called now, the early modern state. And that's it for me.
Would you take a minute to talk about Bitcoin? With the currency seeming to, develop out of a real necessity, is Bitcoin serving any sort of equivalent need in today's economy?
So Bitcoin does have some advantages. Its main selling point is that its quantity is bound by 21 million units, so there will never be high inflation. If we all choose to adopt Bitcoin, there will not be high inflation. The algorithm simply wouldn't allow anyone to produce more money than that. And the current inflation, and even before that, the official inflation target of all central banks of 2% per year, that's infuriating for many people. 2% per year, it adds up with compounding, it adds up to losing 50% of the value of your money in 35 years. That's a lot. So Bitcoin has this advantage. Bitcoin also is completely anonymous. You maintain your privacy completely. The government cannot really confiscate it very easily. So it has advantages. You might say it's necessity. Now, in terms of a difference between Bitcoin and normal money, is exactly this point of legal tender for taxes. Bitcoin is not legal tender for taxes except for El Salvador, which doesn't have its own coin. But a country that has its own currency, like the US or Israel or any other country, they have no interest whatsoever in legalizing tax payments in Bitcoin because that's the anchor of their own currency. Like, why would they do it? Now, can Bitcoin ignore this feature? Well, many Bitcoin enthusiasts ignore it. But 2-3 weeks ago, when they had to pay taxes, probably they realized they had a problem because you have to obtain US dollars. Even if you hate it, the IRS wants dollars, you better get dollars. Now, if it's only once a year, you can go to the Bitcoin market and sell your Bitcoin and obtain dollars. But that's just a small part of the story because many people, many businesses pay taxes throughout the year. And these are large amounts, very large amounts. And millions of people are employed by the government and are being paid with that currency. And Bitcoiners just ignored it. And I don't think you can ignore it. It's this huge elephant in the room. And just pretending that you can ignore the government when deciding what is money, I don't see it working. So this exact point, legal tender money, that's what separates legal normal currency from Bitcoin. That the government guarantees that it will circulate simply by accepting it in taxes.
How long did this, I mean, was this great idea that the Massachusetts Puritans have, how quickly did it take for other people to adopt that?
So again, it took war to make it happen. 1703, South Carolina, because they had war with Spanish Florida, I think. And in 1709, there was a new war of all of New England with Canada. And all of New England adopted this idea. They even used the exact same text, like totally copied Massachusetts. And eventually, almost all the colonies had this kind of paper money during wars. And actually, they were very disciplined, Massachusetts, at first. They first raised taxes, then they printed money in the same amount, meaning they only wanted to solve a liquidity problem of converting this huge debt into cash. They didn't just print money and say, well, let's just create inflation. They did not do that. They were extremely careful, perhaps as careful and disciplined as only Puritans can be. And it survived for about one generation. In the 1710s, Massachusetts and other colonies began to print too much money, more than they taxed back. So inflation began, and it became a hot political issue in all the colonies. Eventually, the British prohibited it with the Currency Acts, which led in some ways to the revolution, kind of contributed a lot to the anger of the colonies about British policies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, Dror. It's been a privilege to have you here with us